Hello and welcome to another edition of Hypnosis Helps with me, Neil Myers, and my colleague Bill Miller, both hypnosis practitioners here in Connecticut. And welcome back into the new year. And the new year is a particularly busy time for us in this profession. It seems people are thinking about changes in behaviours, changes in their lives generally, so we tend to get busy. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from what we've done on previous shows. We're going to be focusing on a particular topic area, specifically hypnosis in its application for stammering and stuttering. And in doing so, we're going to talk not only about some of the work that we've done, but specifically we're going to look back a little bit into the history of how hypnosis has helped with this. And specifically we're going to be looking at the work in connection with this of one man. He's a man that we've mentioned many times before on the show. His name was Dave Ellman. David Ellman taught hypnosis particularly during the 40s, 50s and the early 60s, when unfortunately he passed away in 1962. So the material that you're going to hear in connection with that is old, but it's still very, very relevant.
And again,
That's Dave calling out, right? That's live TV, folks. Let's turn these things off.
Again, Dave was actually, when you say he was actually teaching doctors, dentists, doctors, and psychologists, and so forth. So he ran classes all across the country and taught thousands of doctors.
Yes.
So
yes.
He was really top notch and really was working with the medical profession.
Absolutely, and I thank you for reminding us of that, Bill, because even though Dave Ellman himself was not a doctor, he was not medically trained, he determined that in the nature of his work, he was only going to work and only did work to teach doctors, dentists, and of course by doctors and dentists that also include psychotherapists,
right.
Psychiatrists,
right.
But basically people that had medical training and the people who assisted them.
Right.
And over the course of I think actually Dave's teaching, I think he was actively teaching, I think it was 17 years. And in that 17 years, he literally taught thousands and thousands of doctors across the country because they learn in these big groups. So you're going to hear some of that and some of the material. And also you're going to hear why it's relevant today.
Still.
Right.
And
really how sophisticated even then what he was doing and the differences between the way he works and we work.
Right.
So why don't you kick off the topic?
All right. So to prepare for this, I actually always want to know, well, what does the official medical profession consider as a definition of stuttering or stammering?
Right.
And in doing that, I looked at the Mayo Clinic website and the Cleveland Clinic website because they are really, world-renowned, and you can really trust their stuff, and some other things. And so you talk about stuttering versus stammering, and is there a difference? If you talk to a layperson, they'll say there's a difference. They'll say stuttering is the repetition of the first letters of a word, like stutter.
Right.
Whereas they'll say, well, stammering is getting stuck on the beginning of a word, like stutter, right? And things like that, just to give a kind of an example of how it is. So they would, a layperson might differentiate the two. When I looked at these websites, well, the Mayo Clinic says that they're the same thing. And I'll have to read it because it's a technical term. They call them both childhood onset fluency disorder. So fluency in being able to speak.
Right.
Okay. Cleveland Clinic actually agrees with that as far as they said, yeah, we consider it, one thing, stuttering and stammering, as the same kind of syndrome, and they define it, as where the flow of speech is interrupted by different things, and they say prolongation of speech sounds, like what we talked about, just stammering, repetitions of sounds, difficulty speaking a new word, so you get stuck and it can't come out, and then they even include the person feeling tense when they're getting ready to speak, because it halts them from speaking.
And this is very interesting because we had somebody come to both of us just recently, and as I recall, the difficulty was the last one there, feeling tense upon trying to speak.
Right.
And sometimes either they couldn't speak or occasionally the words I think as I remember, would sometimes tumble out in a confused order.
They tumble, and I know the client you're talking about. They tumble and they kind of get morphed a bit, so that they weren't exactly clear and crisp.
And I suppose this goes back to fluency as well.
Right, and I think that's why they define it as one kind of thing.
Right.
And then Cleveland Clinic also says that people who have this fluency disorder may also have tremors of the lips and jaw, may also have rapid eye blinks or other movements in other parts of the body. And what they were saying is that some of those movements is kind of the person's attempt to try to make themselves start speaking.
Right.
So if they're having the problem getting anything out, is those kind of movements sometimes help them.
Right.
And so forth. But if you look at that whole thing, and you look at you might get stuck on a word, change the sounds, you may have trembling, this is a pretty significant thing for the person who experiences it.
Oh, I think, I recall when we were talking about this topic, I remember from college, we had a lecturer, as we call them in the UK. I think you call it just a professor out here, but very senior man, doctor, top researcher, really, really good guy. And he had both what we'd think of as a stammer and a stutter, and they were very, very prolonged when they occurred.
Right.
And so I liked the man, but listening to him lecture was quite painful for all of us, because it would, you'd wait for the words to emerge. And when he was speaking to you, of course, the tendency is you want to finish people's words, and that's what you don't want to do, because you want to give them the gap to speak. And I mean, obviously for him in that profession, and of course there are some very, very famous people. There was a film not so long ago, The King's Speech, talking about the speech difficulties of a very shy man, the current Queen Elizabeth II's father, George VI. Yep. And that highlighted the difficulties he had with speech. Some people don't know that one of the most famous orators of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, suffered from considerable speech difficulties, impediment, lisps and stutters, and he developed a series of mannerisms to cover it over, and so that's why these Churchillian sounds of we would, and they're all to cover over speech defects, which he later admitted in his life. So there are people who found themselves in a position, particularly obviously Churchill, where he had to speak in public, being a member of Parliament, being a member of the government, of course later on Prime Minister, and he had to find ways to cover this up. Actually, one of the most famous, it just comes to mind, I'm being a music fan, the composer Mozart wrote an opera in which somebody had a stammer, and he wrote in the stammer until it was pointed out to him by one of the singers, who in fact had a stammer, that when people sing, they don't stammer or stutter. And Mozart changed it. He changed it, although he does give poor Papageno something later on. But so you see, so the reason I mention this is it's been present for a very, very long time. Speech impediments and patterns are not something new. They're not something. They're something that have been there throughout the ages. I think the most famous example of age is the Roman Emperor Claudius, who was supposed to have any terrible stammers and stutters and tics and movements and things.
The other thing, and not to dwell on it too much, but to really drive home how this is really significant. It's not a minor thing for somebody. You could choose a whole profession simply so that you don't have to speak. In certain situations that it occurs. So it could change the whole course of somebody's life.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not a simple, easy thing.
Not at all. And so what's the conventional treatment? Well, I mean, these days we'd send people to speech therapists. And there are various treatments. One of the things that I think we should emphasise right from the beginning, and is reinforced in Elman, is that I don't think there are any instances of pathology. We're not talking about an illness causing it. We're not talking even about, occasionally people can have palatal malformations and things, but these are extremely rare. We're not talking about that really.
Right.
Although very often they'll try and address things because it appears that there seems to be a physical manifestation.
Right.
And in the film, The King's Speech, in which the person who again wasn't a trained doctor but had some very innovative methods, was basically using a series of management techniques to overcome these problems.
Right. Right. And actually, for people who don't know the film, he actually wasn't a physician.
No.
He was actually an actor.
Right.
You know,
right.
But he
An
knew
amateur
how to
actor.
get past it.
Right.
You know, and so yeah. So and the other thing is, you know, and even when they go to treatment, speech therapists, our recent client, he was in it for years.
Yes.
So it's really significant thing. So anyway, so that really kind of wraps that part of it. So why don't you talk about Dave Ellman, our friend there,
right?
And what he did at the time to try to help people with stuttering and stammering.
Well, so this is one instance in which I say we're going to vary a little bit because we're going to talk quite a lot about Dave Ellman, how he treated, and how we would treat. And you know, I got the book here, and it's and he starts off by saying, "There's no such thing as a congenital stutter. A stutter or stammer must be precipitated." And this is a key jumping off point. There's an essential cause. There's a reason why it happens, and this comes back really to the very fundamentals of how we work. And when I say how we work, our approach to hypnosis,
right,
as part of treatment, is that things they're not by accident. They happen for a reason.
Right.
There is a traceable cause.
And we're not talking like Dave was
right.
saying that it's not. He could never find a case with pathology, a real
right.
physical reason.
Right.
So when he says there was always a cause, he means there was always some event in that person's life,
right,
a traumatic event that caused them to start stuttering.
Right, and just in the simplest way, he points out, and this remains true, is that there is an onset. There's a point where they begin, and there's a point before where they didn't. People don't start off stammering or stuttering.
Right.
It happens. It can happen quite early. It can happen even 2 years old.
Right.
But there's a starting point.
Right.
And if there's a starting point, he works on the assumption that there is a cause,
Right.
and that cause is traceable. And since the cause there isn't a pathology, there must be an emotional cause.
There must be an emotional cause. And one of the things that he mentions is that a lot of times when you ask a client, oh, you know, how long has it been? They might say, well, I've always had it.
Yes.
And they can't remember when it started. Well,
right.
when he does his work, he always finds that that's never the case.
Right.
And that there is a specific point at which it starts.
Yes, exactly.
And he uses that as, and you're going to talk about that in a minute, he uses that as a way of getting at the cause.
Yes.
And helping.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a starting point. Now, here's an interesting and subtle point that if you folks who've watched the show before will talk about. When we talk about the cause of things, the cause of anything, we use a terminology called an initial sensitizing event, something that's at the base, at the cause. But the difficulty is that the initial sensitizing event and the triggering event may not be the same thing. So this can present a challenge in the work that we do.
So just to be clear, what you're just saying for the audience, because it's kind of technical.
It
is you may have, let's say at age 1, an initial sensitizing event, and we'll talk about that, right? But it doesn't trigger the stutter.
Right.
Then you have a similar event perhaps at age 2 or 3 or whatever, and that right after that event, you have the stutter. That's
right.
the triggering event.
Right.
So you've got the initial sensitizing event versus the triggering event.
Yes, and a simple analogy, folks, for the way of thinking about this is, it's the perhaps like the straw that breaks the camel's back.
That's a good way of thinking of it.
It's not the first straw; it's the build-up of the straw, and the compounding of the specific links emotionally that in the end result in the stammer or the stutter,
right,
as a manifestation of that emotional trauma. That's the key. Now, if we're only looking at the period of time when it actually begins, that may be, but frequently isn't, the initial sensitizing event. And
right.
This is really a key point in all the work that we do. In fact, it really goes back to all the work that we do in trauma, because here Ellman is stating, and it's still agreed today by example, evidence, study, that it's trauma that's at the base of this speech. How's it put? How do they put it? The interrupted fluency.
Right. Speech
the
fluency
onset
disorder.
of the fluency disorder.
Right.
Right. And in the same way, whenever we're talking about trauma that results in a physical manifestation or a behavioural or emotional manifestation, one of the key tenets of our work is that it's not necessarily what we would think it is. That's the strange thing. One of the most common examples of this, and we're going to spend time talking about it as a whole program, maybe more than one, is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The conventional view is that it's the particular nasty event or the close proximity of nasty events, either that people are subject to, witness or perpetrate themselves, that causes the trauma. But in our observation and in the observation of other professionals, they are things that are built on seeds of earlier traumas which were compounded by those events and manifest afterwards. And this is a very, very, very important point, because if one doesn't understand this, all one's time and attention is focused on what appears to be the thing that triggers it and causes it, yet there isn't any lasting healing or change.
Exactly. And so that's a really important point, because the initial sensitizing event may not be the most quote-unquote traumatic event. The triggering event could be more traumatic in nature than the initial sensitizing event.
Yes.
But like I love your analogy about the straw that breaks. It builds up.
Right.
It happens once. You have a similar emotional thing happen twice.
Right.
Then the third time, that's it. And this could be, you know, the most traumatic thing or whatever, or just the build-up.
Right.
You know.
And this is very common also. Another example which is close is when we see with certain fears and phobias.
Right.
People may feel, for example, mildly nervous about driving over a high bridge, but gradually over time they seem to get more so, and they reach a point when all of a sudden they just can't do it.
Right.
And what's the triggering event? You could say, well, it's just that moment when they say, I'm not doing that, I just can't. I feel tremendous anxiety and panic if I even attempt it. But they know, and we know, that's not really true. There's something that's been going on before.
Right.
And sometimes it's observable, and sometimes it slips completely beneath the level of consciousness.
And the funny part about it is that, as we talked before, events in the subconscious are hooked by, they're connected by emotions.
Yes.
Similar emotions.
Yes.
So it can even be a completely different type of event.
Absolutely.
That could be the initial. It's
Absolutely.
something you wouldn't say, well, how does that relate to this?
Yes.
So a phobia, for instance, you know, of maybe spiders, maybe they had a triggering event where a spider bit them,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and but it could be not the initial event, and it could be something different.
It could be the pinch of the bite. It could be something. It could be, so, you know, you might be compounding that event by pinching them.
Right.
You know, I mean, one doesn't know until one starts to investigate it.
Right.
And so here, this is where Ellman begins to talk about using what he calls, and is still called sometimes, hypnoanalysis. We don't really call it that so much anymore, but it's okay. It's the same thing. By analysis, he means they're investigating to try and find what this cause is.
Right, under hypnosis.
Right.
Yep.
And so the first key rule when we do this is that this is something that can only properly be done in a hypnotic state.
Right.
In other words, there has to be bypass, as you've heard us talk about many times, there has to be bypass of the critical faculty and the admission of acceptable selective thinking. Without that, the conscious mind is not going to be able to reveal what the cause is.
Right. Right.
Unfortunately.
And one thing it kind of backs us up just for a quick second.
Sure.
One thing though to make sure we talk about for a second is that what Dave Ellman said is, look, you know, speech therapist or whatever is going to treat the effect.
Yes.
And what he says is you really got to get back to the cause.
Right.
If you don't get back to the cause, you know, you can treat the effect a lot, and it may not significantly improve it.
Yes, or you may get temporary relief or partial relief, or the other thing is you get a whole series, as we talked about Churchill and other people, of coping mechanisms and masking activities which give the impression that it's not there.
Right.
But of course, even if the effect is not there, it doesn't mean the emotional cause is not there.
Right.
Ellman's key point was, and it still holds true today, both by observation and practice, is get to the initial cause and the stammer and the stutter stops. And so folks, just at this point, if you know anybody out there that's stammering or stuttering or something similar to that, pay attention to what's happening next, because if they're open to this type of help, they'll want to do it.
And a corollary to that too, to make sure we're talking about it right, is that remember too, when even in our case, when we're using regression, and you'll talk about that, is we don't just go to the triggering event.
Right.
We actually the quote unquote cause, even though you got to get to the initial sensitizing event.
Yeah.
You got to fix it there. And everything. So anyways, so that we have to even get down to that level.
Right. And so the first case that I just want to mention, and again, this is right from Elman, and I'm not going to read through everything that's in there, but the highlights of it is he talks about an example of a man who'd been stuttering for some considerable period of time, and he regressed him. We're going to talk about in a bit how he regressed him. By regression, again, we want to be really clear, we're not talking about anything like past life regression or anything like that. We merely mean going backwards to when things started.
Right, taking them back to the age when it started.
Right, and in this instance, Elman found that he was stuttering even when he was 5 years old, and he was stuttering at 4 years old. But then he gets back to an incident when he's 2 years old. And he finds that at 2 years old, this is when this began. And the incident was, there was a lumber yard near his home, and as a 2-year-old child, he watched a distressing event, which is he watched two men fighting. And as Elman puts it, this fight develops into a tremendous battle. And I'll read you folks the final sentence, because then I think you'll see what causes the problem. He says, finally, one of the men was knocked to the ground, and when he managed to get up, he grabbed an axe, it was a lumber yard that was lying nearby, and struck his assailant, knocking him to the ground, and then chopped off his head.
In front of this little boy.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, they didn't know that the boy was watching this, and so naturally, as we would be, let alone a child, I think the child was terrified. And he ran home to his mother, but he was afraid to say anything. He was afraid to say anything because he was afraid that they might do the same thing to him.
Right. He was afraid that they may have seen him.
Right.
And they may come after him.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course his mother naturally asked him what was wrong.
Right.
She didn't get a response, and he'd reached a point in his life where he didn't want to talk and couldn't respond, and that was where the stutter began.
Right.
So here you see, folks, we have a very, very, very clear event and a clear start, and it's a mystery to his mother. I mean, as far as she's concerned, he goes out one day to play, he comes back, and all of a sudden he can't speak.
Right.
She knows something has happened, but nobody can find it out. And again, this was something that is when it began. My understanding is he didn't have a recollection of this event. Right? He might have recalled it in certain detail, but not to that degree.
Yeah.
So he takes him back to this event.
So that's really important, because I read that case and I wasn't sure if he was consciously knew it. That's part of the problem with a lot of things we work on. The event, especially if it's a huge trauma, like watching someone's head get chopped off.
Yes.
It may be shielded from you, so
Right.
your conscious mind may not even know it anymore.
Right.
Because your subconscious is trying to protect you from that knowledge.
Right.
And so conventional therapy, even a psychotherapist, if they were trying to get them, could not find this.
And even if they could, my contention is that there then has to be, which we're going to see in a minute, a process of emotional release.
Right.
Because it's the emotions, it's the terror that's bound to this, and then becomes compounding. So every time he's frightened, every time something scares him, every time there's something that he wants to talk about and can't say in connection with that, it's going to shut down that speech more and more and more, and that's going to get compounded over a lifetime. And
this is going to sound very strange, not to you, but to the audience, is that the thing that it really is causing the problem isn't someone's head getting chopped off.
No.
That's terrible, obviously, but that's not what causes the child the problem.
No.
It's the terror that gets trapped inside him at that age and stays there that causes the problem.
Yes.
And so, you can't just black out the event name, because if you think about it, if he did, consciously not know of that, he's still stuttering.
Yes.
He still has the problem.
Right.
And it's because that emotion is trapped in that young child,
right.
and has never been released.
Right. And I believe, it's my belief that based upon what we do, if that child at that moment in time had been able to cry, express his terror or his horror or his fear, talk about the incident, describe it, then my belief is that he wouldn't have had a stutter or a
right.
stammer or any impediment,
right.
but it all gets trapped inside. And the consistent thing in all these events, which we're going to look at through the cases, and what we've also found and what is found, is that there's a stifled cry.
Right.
Now, I want to be really clear about something. Stifled cries or stifled emotions do not always translate into stammers and stutters.
Mm-hmm.
They can be other things. For example, I worked recently with somebody where she wanted to say something, but it didn't come out as that. It came out as choking, leading first from panic attacks, later asthma attacks.
Right.
So there was an incident in where something was caught, but it didn't manifest as a stammer or a stutter.
Right.
It manifested in that way. So you might have other instances of trauma. They don't all manifest in the same way. This is another thing that we learn as we work with people.
Right.
Just because there's a particular manifestation doesn't mean that there's a routine cause.
Right.
And so that's a very, very important point as well.
Right. And you know, to kind of go into just a secondary kind of examples of that, you know, you're right. If he'd been able to release it somehow at the time, it wouldn't have caused the problems.
Right.
They find in animals that they have ways of releasing stress. So if an animal is chased by a predator, what they actually find is that if the animal gets away, they start a process of shaking.
Right.
And it's the body movements of their body that releases that stress that that would be trapped in an animal even, and cause them problems.
Right.
There's a very famous case of some school children that were kidnapped, I think in Mexico, and buried alive in a big trailer. And all these children, you know, except for one, was terrified and just kind of hunkered down and didn't move and didn't do anything. And there was one child that said, "I'm getting out of here." And he got up and he kept moving his body, and he got out of it, right? And except for him, every one of them had psychological problems afterwards. And the psychologist contends that the reason he didn't is because he had body movements going on to release that stress, and he was doing something to not trap it.
And this is one of the reasons why that we say, just because people are subjected to a particular stress or a particular event, it doesn't mean they're going to respond in the same way.
Right.
One has to the event is important. It's not necessarily the most significant thing in the relief of the effective cause.
Right.
That's not what we're looking at. Very, very important point, folks, and very, very central to what we do.
Right.
So anybody that comes to us or anybody that works in a way similar to the way that we're describing, that's what we're looking for.
Right.
And again, the emphasis is we must do this in a hypnotic state.
Right.
And only in a state of deep hypnosis. If there was something else, we do it. Now, of course, you know, we're using hypnosis as a tool. We're using the bypass of the critical faculty for healing in the subconscious mind. We just use the term hypnosis as a shorthand. You could call it anything.
Right.
But there are specific methodologies and techniques that enable you to get to that point.
Right.
That's the key.
Right.
So
And you know, it's interesting too. Is again, it's not the event, because if you think if it was the event that's really causing the problems, well, every one of those children, including that one young man that dug himself out, he would be traumatized. He would have emotional problems afterwards.
that's true.
And he did not have them. So it wasn't being buried alive that caused it. It was the terror and everything that got trapped inside him
Yes.
that caused it. Because he should, if it was just simply being buried alive,
Right.
then he should have had problems.
Yes, I agree.
So
It's,
anyways, so I know we've got a couple other cases here that...
Oh, we've got a few, yeah.
Yeah,
So
that Elman worked with.
So one of them, and again, I'm just going to give the highlights, folks, is that he's working with a woman who she's been stuttering for 50 years, and she believes that she's been doing this as a baby, but he's a little bit sceptical about that. But what regression reveals that while she was 2, she was ill in bed, and her mother and father were quarrelling quite, and they began to argue quite